Now turning our attention to deployment. And we'll take deployment in two stages. We'll look at the deployment in general, just some general aspects of what what's involved in getting a web page onto the intranet for public browsing. And secondly, we look at specific technology explored in the labs here. The two labs accompanying this series require first deployment, examined using Heart and Surge, and then templating, which we've just reviewed in a previous talk. So let's talk a little about deployment for a few moments. Issues to be addressed when we're considering taking our website into the cloud. The notion of clients and servers, distinguishing those roles, hosting providers, the domain name, how we might transfer our site to the remote host. General considerations around HTTP and absolute and relative paths, which we've briefly touched on when we considered templating. So we know that if accessing a web page remotely, it must exist somewhere. That's somewhere we might call the web server. And that web server has access to a file system, perhaps, or a content management system, and it's delivering up our pages on request. And those requests come from client browsers. Requests arrive at the browser, from the browser to the web server. It's usually a page we're specifying, so it's a GET request, and the server responds with the page, which is delivered to the browser's viewport and rendered accordingly. Selecting a hosting company, well, there's a lot of choices, and the field has moved on quite a lot from the early days of the internet. There's no shortage of attractive and very low cost providers in this sphere. You might consider check tech support, what kind of data transfer the hosting company provides. Do they do backups? Does the company provide domain names? What kind of reliability do they have? Is there other add-ons available? How much do these cost in each case? Domain name you're familiar with, www. Some unique name plus some country origin, or ending as we call it. These are standard names now that are traded globally, and of course we have a huge proliferation of possible endings. Those domains, the .com, .de, .ie, are all controlled by international standards body, and these individual hosting companies would be acquiring or buying rights to sell on those domains within the given subdomain they've selected. And it can be very cheap. It's a well-known one, GoDaddy. You could have a .com domain for quite low cost. Remember, when you get a domain like this, you're renting it though, for as long as you keep up your subscriptions. You don't really buy it in perpetuity. Hover, again, another well-known and reputable DNS trader. So how do we get our files onto the cloud provider? Number of different ways for doing this. We've got to, first of all, package our profiles, make sure we ship them over to the online provider, and then the files must be replicated on that provider and then delivered as requested. Many technologies have come and gone over the years for doing this. The original was FTP. You may have heard of Dropbox, which is an attractive way of providing content to providers these days. WebDAV, which is kind of like a virtual disk mounting system. And of course, email attachments, still supported, although very insecure. And you may have heard of Git. Git push is becoming increasingly common. When the web server is running, it is of course not delivering your files in any of these protocols that I've mentioned. It's delivering your files over HTTP. HTTP requests arrive at a server, and your website is delivered back as HTTP responses. Each response is one complete document. That document may have been composed on the server by multiple fragments using a templating engine, but that templating is invisible to the client, which just sees complete pages. Those request response sequences then are well established international standards. If you make a request for a page that doesn't exist, you get a 404. You may even be familiar with that number appearing. 404 means the web server could not locate the page. It may mean you have an incorrect link on your site, causing the 404 to be generated. Now we have, if you've done any of the labs, wrestled a little bit with absolute and relative paths. Before we had a templating engine and a web server, we were struggling with dot and dot dot and / just to navigate around a relative file system, particularly for assets. This can be quite challenging to maintain longer term, and particularly we find we're very often doing this kind of thing here to navigate to a specific element or specific page. If we're deploying to a web server, we really want to simplify that and always use absolute paths. Absolute paths make it significantly simpler to build up our content in a reliable manner. So just be aware of that. If you use absolute paths without a web server, you may find that your web page ends up looking like this when you attempt to deploy it. If you're using a web server though, and we've been using the HARP web server in the lab, then we'll be guarding against that. Okay, that's just a brief review of aspects around deployment. We'll return shortly to look at specific technology we're using in our experiments.